Okay, so in this module, we're going to be looking at aperture and how it affects the depth of field and the exposure of our shot. We're also going to be creating a third camera. You'll see that I already have it created here, but we'll go through the process. It'll be our wide shot, or kind of what this viewport is looking at right now, like a two shot of the two. We can take a look right now. Check out this wide shot. Oh, it's totally black. Why is that? Well, that's because the camera is behind our set right now. So I've gone ahead and created a folder that contains that wall. Let me show it to you really quick. We'll pop out and we'll get out of into our viewport view here. And we have our flyaway wall. And this is what they're called on set, is typically, you would ask the art department to fly it away because we need to get to the other side. And let's pull up our camera here with G. We need to get to the other side in order to frame up our wide shot and still have a nicely composed shot. So you can just unmute, you can kind of mute the wall here by clicking on the eyeball, and we'll be able to look through it. So now if we go into our wide shot and hit G again, we have our shot set up for our wide or tight two, whatever you want to call it. But essentially we're putting the two actors in the same shot because we've only had the close-ups. And now, as part of the coverage for the scene, we want to be able to give something else for the editor to work with, or in this case, if it's you, for you to work with, to cut away back and show the geography of the scene and whatnot. And typically, on a scene like this, we're going to do some pretty typical and a tried and true coverage, right? We're going to do close-ups on each camera, on each character, one on Ziva, one on Trey. And this one's a more unorthodox close-up, and we looked at that earlier. And then we'll get our wide. Typically, you'd probably want to do an over-the-shoulder on each character as well. We'll look at that later on. We'll create those a little bit quicker, and obviously a wide or a two-shot of the two actors in the scene. So we'll take a look at how to create this later. Just wanted to show it to you really quickly. Let's resume our conversation about depth of field and how it affects our shot. So we can leave the wall open there for now. It's not going to really do a ton. But I wanted to briefly talk to you about aperture. So on a physical lens, you have different numbers on the lens that would control the aperture / the exposure of your shot. So if we jump into our close-up Ziva over here, and we jump into the details panel, make sure you're clicked on the close-up Ziva there, and we have a current aperture of 1.8. Now, this is a fairly wide open number to work with, and that keeps the background nice and soft, right? I typically like to live generally on a 2 to 2.8 on the lens, be it on set or even virtual cinematography, just to keep things blurry and to degrade the image as much as we can virtually specifically. But also in real life, when we're so wide open, typically that's when some of the imperfections or the degrading of the image starts to happen. We start to have a little bit of fall off on the lens, on the edges. We get a little bit darker, and maybe the depth of field becomes a little bit, or the bokeh starts to swirl a little bit on the edges. And that might be more desirable on a narrative film where you're trying to kind of like degrade the image as much as you can and make it look natural and organic. But if you're shooting a commercial and the product calls for being super clean and precise and pristine, then you might want to shoot closer to a 5.6 where the background might be a little bit deeper. And also you'd be shooting closer to the sweet spot of the lens. So every lens has like a sweet spot in which it looks its most pristine, or where it likes to be in terms of like high quality and high fidelity imagery. For us, we don't really want that. We want to kind of, again, we want to just add imperfections to the scenes, especially because you're working in a virtual environment, and we're already working with such a clean, pristine image. We kind of want to stay away from that as much as we can. So I just wanted to give you a little background on that. Typically, this number, the higher it is, the deeper the depth of field, the sharper your background is going to look. And the lower the number, the opposite's going to happen, right? We're going to have the blurrier background. We're going to have a shallower depth of field. So aperture, as you'll see, controls the depth of field and the exposure in this case. But we have other ways of of changing that if we want. I'll show you that in a second. But for demonstration purposes, we're going to go to a 5.6 here. We're going to get darker because we're closing the aperture. We're letting less light into the lens if this was a physical lens. And these numbers are representative of, in terms of f-stop. You'll see if you hover over here, it tells you. Now, you can go in between any of these numbers. If you just click and drag, you can go anything in between all of those numbers, right? You'll see that as I click and drag, I'm getting brighter and brighter and darker if I go to the right, and the higher the number. And also the depth of field, notice the bokeh over here is getting smaller and sharper, right? Our background is getting, and it's hard to demonstrate this when as the image is getting darker, but I'll do a quick demo right now too to show you without that. So again, quickly recapping, the smaller the number, the shallower your background, the blurrier your background, and the higher the number, the opposite will happen. We have a deeper depth of field and a sharper image. So let's go ahead and quickly, I'm going to show you a quick little trick. If you don't want it to affect your exposure at the same time as your depth of field, there's something we can do for that. So we're going to go into our exposure tab here, EXP in the camera details panel. We'll search for exposure, and you'll notice that we have it set to manual, which we did early on, and that's what we want in order to keep it as close to reality as possible, right? But now we want to just take a look at depth of field without affecting the exposure of the shot. So we're going, while you're looking through the camera, make sure you do that. We're going to change this to auto exposure histogram, and you're going to see it's way blown out. That's okay. That's because we have our exposure compensation 6, which we don't want for this. And we're going to just go to 0. You'll see it's still a little bit bright, but let's go to -2. Just kind of get it back to that exposure level we had earlier. And what this is going to do is it's going to just make the camera auto expose. So any changes we do with the aperture right now is just going to, the engine's going to calculate that exposure change, and it's going to just automatically do it for you without you even noticing. So you'll see that if I change my aperture now, all that's changing is the depth of field. We're not changing the exposure level anymore. And it's just a really good way to kind of demo this depth of field changes your background, your aperture number changes your depth of field / the blurriness of your background, right? So you might want to work like this. That's totally fine. You can leave it on the auto exposure tab and do the compensation that you need for your scene, and not have to ever deal with changing when you're changing apertures, that it's also changing your exposure. That's fine to do. You can do it. So I wanted to show you that tip there. We're going to go back to our 1.8 and take a look at that. That feels pretty natural to me. It's not overdone. It's blurry, but in a good way, and we're not overdoing it. I can show you that if this minimum f-stop and maximum f-stop here in the lens settings, you can change those, and those will affect how far you can go on your current aperture down here. So if I just put this minimum f-stop 1.4, for example, or we can even go back to the default, which is 1.2. I will only be able to go down to a 1.2. That kind of stops it there. But if you wanted to go further than that, we can go to 0.1 like I had just a second ago. And we can start to go even further wide open, which wouldn't match any lens that exists in reality. But we would be able to do that in engine, and you can go even blurrier and shallower. The problem, as you're seeing here, is we start to get into these unrealistic values. It just doesn't look right anymore. We start to get into this uncanny valley of camera. And we don't want to do that. We want to try and keep it as realistic as possible. So I just want to show you that you can go there, change that number if you want to go further than a 1.2 or a 22. And in fact, let's do that. Let's go to like a 60 here on the max f-stop, and let's just close it all the way down. Let's go to a 60, and you'll see that there's no blurriness whatsoever. We're completely sharp everywhere because we're shooting at a 60 aperture, which again wouldn't exist on almost any lens. So you can change those max and minimums. We're going to just go back to the default here. That's close to what a real lens would be. And we're going to do, we're going to go back to our 1.8. So I just wanted to show you that really quick. Let's reframe just a bit here. Can tilt down. And just to see, so you understood the relationship between aperture and exposure and depth of field and all of that. So now that we've looked at that, I'd like to demonstrate really quick in our demo maps, our favorites, and take a look at all that. And then we'll come back to our wide shot that we want to recompose. So just briefly, let's take a look at this demo map really quick. So you know the drill. We'll go to our content browser, maps, demos, and depth of field demo map. Open that, save our work. And here we are in the demo map. We're going to go up to our cinematics, load up our depth of field demo sequence. Our actors are in place. You'll see we have 3 new cameras here. One's a 1.4, a 2.8, and a 5.6. Let's again go to our window. Let's go to our viewport and load up viewport 2. We have our 2 viewports here, nice. And on the left side, let's go to perspective and load up our 1.4. And on the right side, we're going to go to perspective and load up our 5.6 camera. So, and let's go ahead and make sure this is in the cinematic viewport. Sometimes it changes. Again, we'll reload it in 5.6. Okay. Let's hit G on both viewports, make them go away. And we'll go back to just clicking on a folder, kind of makes anything that you're clicking on disappear. And here we are. We've already kind of demonstrated this, but I just wanted to show you once again, 1.4 aperture over on the left side. Our background's pretty blurry. We have some nice bokeh in the background. And on the right side, we have a 5.6. And it's still blurry back here, but we start to get a little bit deeper depth of field and hence less blurry in the midground and so on and so forth. So quick demonstration here. We can load up the 2.8 as well. Something in between, and you'll see that the blurriness got a little bit more pronounced, but between a 1.4 and a 2.8, there's a pretty big difference. And the reason is it's 2 stops difference. So we have a 1.4, the next stop would be a 2, and the next stop would be a 2.8, and anything in between. So there's a 2-stop difference between these 2 lenses, or these 2 frames, and there's a pretty pronounced difference in the depth of field. So again, you can judge this by eye. It doesn't have to be a science necessarily, but make sure you stay within realistic values so that you are not getting into the uncanny valley of camera shots. So backing out, we're going to go back to maps, main, and load up module 5 once again. This time we don't have to save. It's okay, because we want it where it was. And we're going to load up our module 5 cinematic. We can close our viewport number 2 now. We're back into our world. And let's go ahead and create our wide shot like we looked at earlier on. So moving along to our coverage into our wide, we're going to go ahead and hit G. We're going to back out here and let's just go ahead and hit W and then hit Alt on your keyboard, press and hold, and we'll drag to the right. And we've just duplicated the close-up Ziva camera. That's a good way of just continuing to create new cameras because it keeps all the settings we've already had. So we'll call this wide V2. And let's go ahead and pilot it by going up to perspective, wide V2. And let's just back it out and into outside of our set. Let's hit G to make everything go away. We're going to pilot it all the way outside of our set. And actually, before we even do anything else, that's because we've reloaded the map, so our set is back here. You can just click on the wall like so. That'll reload our flyaway wall. We can click the I button, and there we go. We're out. We can go now and find our shot outside the set. The beauty of being in virtual environments is we can do that way easier than we would in real life. So, don't be afraid to get outside the set and get the shots you need. We would do this in real life as well. So what we have here on our close-up, what used to be our close-up Ziva shot and has been duplicated, all those settings came along with it. Let's make sure we're looking at what we have. We have a 40 mil 1.8. That's actually a pretty good starting point for this frame. Let's take a look. So we're in a general vicinity of where we want to be. Let's go to our wide V2 camera, make sure we are sharp, draw debug focus plane, and turn it back off. And here we have it. It's actually in pretty good place, more or less where we had the other shot. I'm just kind of like finessing the frame here. We want to see some foreground, and maybe we want to just place it right in the center. We can bring up this these composition overlays over here, and maybe put on the crosshair right in the middle, or even this, and just that'll help us frame up a little bit and make sure that we're kind of in the center of the scene. Something in that vicinity that might help. Doesn't have to be perfect. Feel it out. You make sure you have enough room on this side of the frame, and enough, that we're matching each side of the frame as far as like compositionally. And then we can come down a little, and somewhere in that vicinity feels pretty good. We get a little bit of foreground element here with the books and the desk or whatever this is. And we're kind of breaking up the image into 3 planes. We have a foreground, we have our midground, which is our actors that are in focus, and then the far background is the outside, the exterior. But even the living room starts to come out, be out of focus. The reason for that is because we're on a longer lens. We're on a 40 mil, which is a slightly long lens for a 2-shot or a wide in this case. So that was done on purpose so that we could have a little bit of depth of field. So we could separate the actors and sandwich them in between some foreground out of focus and some background out of focus. And that makes for a prettier frame. So let's go ahead and just for demonstration purposes, see what like a 24 mil, which would probably be a more typical lens, would look like if, we framed up for a wide in the similar fashion. So for one, you see that we got wider, so we see more of their feet and their the room and all that, and it just may not make for it makes for a little bit of a busier composition, right? And also, you'll notice that our depth of field, our background isn't as blurry back there anymore because we're on a wider lens. And maybe you say, hey, well, okay, well, why don't we, Kevin, why don't we bring just the aperture way down? Well, for one, we're still wide enough lens that it's just not affecting it that much. And even if we went to a minimum f-stop of 0.1 for now, let's try that, and did something like this, it just starts to get, again, into uncanny valley. Even though our background is now blurrier and we're kind of sandwiching them into this these 3 planes that, like I talked about, it just looks, I know they're not in focus here. Let's put them in focus really quick. It just doesn't look natural. It looks like I don't know. It looks like something like a tilt shift lens or something, a specialty lens. It just doesn't, it looks like miniatures almost even. So again, just wanted to quickly show that's not the right way of doing this. It just starts to get into uncanny valley. So we'll go back to a 1.2 on the minimum f-stop, and a 1.8 on the current aperture over here, back to what we had. But quickly demonstrating, you see that we just don't have the same kind of feeling that we did on the 40. We'll go back to the 40. We'll go back to our frame we had just a little bit ago, similar frame, somewhere in that vicinity, and make sure that we're sharp on our actors. And that's it. That's our wide shot.